Everyone. So this is the first time I just speak to the notebook to talk about some key concept that I guess you guys has been missing. So this video is just for my friends. Private use only, so it's not for public. It's not for public use. All right. So let's go through some possibly missing concept for you guys. Basically, all these concepts that I will talk about today has been covered before, but let's go through it, and then you will get a much more clear idea because you have finished all your capstone project. So this is some conceptual questions which is very common in technical interview. Somehow, if you are interviewing for back-end developers, or if you are applying for jobs which use some modern framework like React or Angular, they will ask you to explain RESTful. Basically, every one of you has been doing RESTful for so long, for past few months. If you can tell, okay, RESTful involves get, post, put, delete, it's alright. But the more important thing is this is the convention in designing the HTTP API. Whether it's RESTful or they also have some name called SOAP, RPC, all these things are just HTTP API. What they really want you to answer is, okay, it's just a convention, it's habit. So everyone trying to name the API like this way using, first of all, naming the resources. If you want to get resources, then you will get the whole list. If you get resources ID, you get one detail of the item. So basically, it's a convention, and there's several methods which is very common. There are even more, but the four most common methods are get, post, put, and delete, and they are actually representing read, create, update, delete correspondingly. Some of them may ask you about SOAP or RPC, but these two are pretty old technologies. I would say that for RESTful, the advantage of using RESTful is that nowadays everyone is using RESTful for designing the API. No matter you are accessing information from Google, from YouTube, or from Spotify, they're all using RESTful API. Still, RESTful API require a documentation, so that you have to read the documentation in order to understand the request body, the response body. For SOAP and RPC, these two are also some convention, or actually is some standard in designing HTTP API. These two standards actually are quite old-fashioned, but these two standards provide more standard detail on how you document the API. If you want to know more, you can take a look to the Wikipedia. You can see that you have to define the request body and response body in an XML format. But I don't think there's not so many companies still using these two. These two were so common in old days. So the next thing that you guys might missing is the Big O notation. You might heard of Big O notation before, but you may not really understand what it is. Basically, it's a notation that we can talk about it in common to describe the complexity of some data structure or some algorithms. Say, for example, if you want to know in terms of computation, in terms of inserting an element, would that be more efficient if I use doubly linked list or binary search tree? You don't want to tell your colleagues that, okay, doubly linked list because it works like this way, so that's why it inserts something faster. You may just have to tell, okay, for doubly linked list to insert something at the beginning or at the end, it takes just O1, which means that no matter how large is your list, you still spend the same computation time on inserting something. So if you always have to insert something at the end or at the beginning, using some or any data structure that inserting at the end or in the beginning costs you O1, then you don't have to worry about the data size getting bigger. So O1 is the best, of course. Also, you might also talk about the efficiency or the complexity of some algorithm. Say, for example, for quick sort and bubble sort, they also have corresponding big O notation. I forget how large is this, but then you will know what these sortings actually, which one is more suitable for your scenario. So there are also some way that if you're doing performance optimization, usually you will using the big O mindset to check. Okay, if my dataset or database is getting bigger, is the data structure or the algorithm that I'm using is good for me. So you can see, say for example, in Redis, the Redis server, you can choose from some data structure to make your application be more efficient and be more future proven. Since we are talking about data structure, so you might be asked to name some common data structures. For university graduates, usually they will have a semester studying data structure that they're trying to implement each data structure and also learn about the big O notation. I would say if you know nothing about programming before, maybe a whole semester is needed for you to understand the data structure in depth. But then, since you guys have some programming experience, I highly recommend you can read through these 4 common data types: singly linked list, doubly linked list, circular buffer, and binary search tree. These actually are some questions that you guys must have covered before. They also will ask sometimes about stack and queue. These two are also some very common data structure to describe, okay, is your list a stack or is your list a queue? MVC. This one you guys has been using it for so long. MVC actually is very common in backend world, especially like PHP, Java Spring, and there's also one MVC framework called the ASP.NET, the ASP.NET MVC. But for you guys using Node.js, if you just purely use Express, I would say it is not that quite MVC, because you can actually put everything together in just one single file. The perfect example of using MVC is the Node.js examples that we separate the model into the database, the view into the handlebars, controller, you have the service and router to make sure that the request coming in, and then you will have some data logic, and the presentation will just handle by the handlebars. And this is just the common way to distinguish, to separate the files in your backend. It is not necessarily only 3 things. In the Node.js example, you can see we have some utilities, we have services. Actually, it can be even more. But the MVC is the very first concept that I forgot who actually named this one, but it is the very first concept to encourage people to separate the files, separate the logic in a more manageable way. It is getting more popular in front-end world. They are not exactly MVC. They name it as MVVM, model view model. The basic idea is that your model may come from backend, may come from Redux store. Your view is the component, but then for the real entity, say for example, if you are doing the code easy, the question is actually represented by the view model, and then you pass the questions to the component so that you can show it to the screen. So that's why it's MV and VM, MVVM. It's actually borrowed the idea from MVC, and someone actually put all these things into one single family called MV star and MV everything. Alright. Database transactions. I can see most of you haven't done the database transaction before, even in the projects. It is a very helpful thing. Like for example, you want to have some state from one to another one, say for example, register for a user, you will check whether the user had registered before, and then you insert it. So you don't want to say like, okay, I check some user whether they exist or not, and then somehow there's another API coming in, register for the same email, and then you in that API it also checks whether the email had registered before or not. Both registration check that that same user hasn't been registered, and both transaction or both API will trying to insert the same users. So it ends up you have two identical users in your database. So this is not ideal. So transaction help you to protect you from one consistent state to another one. And this is the transaction that you begin the transaction and commit at the end. The idea is not that difficult. Someone will also use the bank as a very intuitive example, saying like, okay, I have to deduct some money from A account to and then put it to the B account. So first of all, I have to deduct the A account first, and then put the money to the B account. If somehow there's some problem here in between, I don't want to deduct the A bank account for a certain amount of money, but I do not deposit to the B account. So I have to go back to the state 1. So this is the use of transactions. There's also one very special concept called the ACID, ACID, atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability. So for MySQL or PostgreSQL, that actually they call it the ACID compliant. That if you're using PostgreSQL or MySQL, you are protected from your transactions are all or nothing. You won't have some broken transaction. If you're using Postgres or MySQL, only valid data is saved. So sometimes if you have some constraint, like the unique constraint, then PostgreSQL will always check it for you. It won't happen in a scenario that there is some invalid data. The transactions do not affect each other. So if you have two transactions running together, both are isolated. As long as they are touching with different rows or table, then it is fine. And durability is that recent data will not be lost. So I'm not sure whether you have experience if you're using Microsoft Word. Sometimes when in the middle that the Microsoft Word has crashed, then you lost everything. So for PostgreSQL, as long as your backend receives the signal that yes, the data has been written, if you unplug the power at the middle and suddenly, then the data will still be saved. The written data will not be lost. Okay, so this is some common concept. If they ask you what is ACID of a database, then you can tell. Testing. So most likely we have been doing actually the integration testing that you involve several components. Say for example, you're testing router, you're testing surface. Unit test is actually more like a single function. So if I want to just test a single function in a router, then you're doing unit tests. But if you're doing something with the router and surface, that you put two things together or two functions together, then it is integration test. Something that we haven't done is the system test. Or sometimes if you're doing front end, it is end-to-end test. Sometimes it's end-to-end. So you can see it's at different levels. For unit tests, you test each individual functions. Of course, there will be a lot of unit tests. For every single function you wrote, you should write the test. And then when you combine several things together to finish something, say for example, if you want to create a post, you have to check whether this user is authorized to create some post. You have to check whether the category that guy selected is correct or not. So you are integrating several things together. So this is integration test. And for the system test or end-to-end test, if you have app deployed to the Amazon, you want to check whether if I click the link from the browser and then I want to create a post within a Mac OS environment, then this is actually end-to-end. You don't really care about single function or don't really care about the router surface. You check the whole thing as a whole and the system test. Sometimes you will not be asked about the difference between integration unit or system test. They will ask, okay, whether you have heard of BDD or TDD. Although these two things look so similar, actually they refer to different things. BDD is a framework that they call the behavioral driven development. So under BDD testing framework, every single test case we will write as, okay, expect something to be something. Describe something, it will do something. So if you still remember the test case syntax is quite familiar. There are a few common framework in JavaScript. I named one in Java that in case you are asked it. In JavaScript, there are 3 mainstream testing framework that implemented BDD's syntax: Mocha, Jasmine, and Jest. And I'm pretty sure that you guys know Jasmine and Jest. And Mocha is actually sharing similar syntax that you can actually easily Google it. So then what is TDD? Is there another syntax? No. TDD is actually what they call the test-driven development. This is a methodology of how you do the project. So you will do the test case first, and then you write the code. So they have a very famous step. I forgot 3 step or 4 step. So the first step is, if you're doing TDD, the first step is you have to write a failed test case. Before you write any implementation, you have to write a failed test case first, and then you implement the code, and then you run the test case, and then turn it into a green light. And then so this is the test-driven development. Everything start with testing first. So there's nothing to do with BDD. You can use TDD with the BDD framework. These two look so similar. It looks like similar, but they are actually referring to 2 different concepts. This is referring to the syntax, and TDD refers to the project methodology. Some common thing is also usually seen is OOP, the object-oriented programming. So I'm not sure whether you guys know public and private. So this is not talking about whether these things can be changed, or it's not talking about whether these things are very security or what. This is actually trying to protect the data from other variable. So for example, you have a component called a car. So inside the car, the engine should be only triggered inside the car. But then the door, to open the door, it could be triggered by the human, right? Something like that. So this is matrix look like this. So if you define something in public, so any other variable can actually access to the public. They can change it, they can call the method. So this modifier can apply to both method and variable. If you define a function as public, then everyone can call that function. If you define a variable as public, then everyone can get or set the variable. So private is another extreme, so only within the class you can access it. But somehow you guys may ignore the protected. Protected actually allows subclass to also access the variable or method. So what is no modifier? In JavaScript we don't have that, or in TypeScript we don't have that. But in some other languages like Java, if you don't define any modifier at all, then by default is something between private and protected. If you do not define modifier, the subclass of that instance or object of class couldn't access the method or variable. But the package, so if you put the things in the same folder, it can still access the method or variable. But this modifier is less common and is not available in TypeScript. You should also know about the distinguish between the class versus instance, or what they call objects. Class methods versus instance methods, class variable versus instance variables. So I think this diagram actually shows very clearly. So a class is actually describing some object about the skeleton, about the blueprint of the object. But then objects is really the real instance, the real implementation. So you have Polo, Mini, and so that's why you define the blueprint of some methods or attribute or variables as the instant methods and instant variable. So as a class, you can't really use this thing. You can't set the speed of all the class blueprint. But once you initialize this car into objects, then you can call these instant methods individually for individual Polo or Mini. So one last thing is design pattern. We have been using design patterns. Design pattern is actually quite is uncommon amongst junior developers. But if there's a chance that you are asked about design patterns, it's good if you can tell. So for Campfire's project, we have been using strategy pattern. You can check if you still recall that you have different strategy of how to paint on the Canvas board, and this is how when you define the class in a similar way, then you can just swap a drawing circle into a drawing rectangle, something like that. Composite pattern. So it is actually referred to the React component. You have a component wrapping a component and then wrapping a component. So this is composite. These two actually you can Google it and then you can see whether you understand these two pattern not at this moment. Because if you haven't implemented before, then maybe it could be difficult for you to understand. But if you have tried it hands-on Canvas and React, I'm pretty sure that you will have better understanding by reading the tests. MVC patterns is also one of the patterns. And also singleton pattern is very common, but we haven't taught it because it's what they call the anti-pattern. It's not a really good way to make it singleton. So singleton actually means that you have a global object that you can access it from anywhere from the program. Is it nice? If you have one single object that you can access it, no matter if from Redux store, from component A or component B, I think that would be pretty good. But then, so many developers found that singleton pattern actually make it harder for you to maintain the app. So that's why we haven't mentioned it before. But it's still very common because it's just too easy for people to use it. Alright, so I think I may not be able to cover the algorithm question today, but I would strongly recommend once you have revised all the conceptual questions, go to Google to Google JavaScript interview questions. You will see a lot of these kind of interview questions. I want you guys to take a look to these questions and then challenge yourself. Say for example, okay, what is the output when this following code is executed? I can hear this is true and false. Let's see the answer. Yes, it's true and false. And this website actually also gives you the explanation, which can give you more concrete and solid understanding about JavaScript. I think these 37 questions is more than enough for you to test your own knowledge. There are even more if you want to know more about some more JavaScript. And there's also some coding challenge. You can see this is the Lalamove challenge. May not have enough time to cover these challenges today. But if you take a look at the backend challenges, it's not that difficult that they just want you to implement a RESTful API and then with free endpoint, so which means free route. They may need to do transaction because they actually Lalamove just like Google Van. They want you to create an order with an origin and destination. They want you to make use of transactions so that an order may not be taken multiple times. They want you to list the order, is very common practice. They will also want you to use some API so that to demonstrate your understanding about the Google API. And they will also want you to use either MySQL or MongoDB. And want you to make a good installation in the start.sh. So they want you to make a script so that if you want to have some seeding or migration, then you should have these things should be done is the start.sh. It's about system admin and deployment. So it's not that difficult. I'm pretty sure that it just takes time. And also the front end, also demonstrating your understanding about how to connect with API, how you can use the Google Map API to do it, and also they also want you to do some mobile responsive, how to deploy it. It's most likely you can use some React. So because they're also switching from jQuery to React. Luckily, you guys learn React. And also P.A, the progressive web app. So it's just like making the experience into more mobile way, and then you define some extra information to the page, so that you provide the logos, the icon, the app name, so that it looks like an app. So they also provide you the wireframe, so you don't have to design the wireframe by your own. I think this is pretty much of today. I hope I can still see you guys in the future and talk about more algorithm questions. Thank you.